Our story begins 20 years before our current time period in the 1950s. Our involvement began with the French Indochina War as we gave them massive economic and military support. Following the French Indochina War, the United States entered the Vietnam struggle despite Albert Peter Dewey's warning, and thus our story unfolds.
It is 1963, and civil rights activists are experimenting with nonviolent tactics, from acts of individual defiance to mass marches and demonstrations. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to direct a march on Washington in August of 1963, and on the famous steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech that impacted millions of people all over the world.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Alongside the civil rights movement, there were still ongoing issues with the Vietnam War looming in the United States. Despite massive United States aid, the French could not retake Vietnam and had to surrender. Before his death, Kennedy had announced his intent to withdraw United States forces from South Vietnam, but Lyndon B. Johnson escalated the nation's role in Vietnam and began what would become America's longest war.
As the U.S. enters into 1964, we see the emergence of entertainment to distract citizens from the ongoing tensions of the Vietnam War. The 4 lads from Liverpool steal the show, emphasizing the youth of the 1960s. The band toured Europe, North America, the Far East, and Australia, and played to 55,600 fans at New York Shea Stadium, setting a record for the largest concert audience. With famous songs such as Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, and She Loves You, the Beatles stole the hearts of thousands of fans across the globe.
Lyndon Baines Johnson, a 4th-generation Texan, took control of the White House in 1964. Alongside his involvement in the civil rights movement, LBJ had another agenda: to alleviate poverty. In May of 1964, Johnson summed up his vision for America in a phrase: the Great Society.
During the Freedom Summer of 1964, large numbers of courageous young people from virtually all of the major civil rights organizations traveled to Mississippi to help African Americans register to vote. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the newly elected president, was able to push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex.
In 1964, you also see the emergence of hippies. Some individuals were seen as passionate idealists seeking to establish a more equitable and loving world. Others adopted a more individual focus, using LSD or meditation or study of Eastern religions to explore the inner depths of their own consciousness. Most significant development was the experimentation with mind-altering drugs such as LSD. Ken Kesey was conducting a drug study at Stanford University, and he financed a cross-country excursion with a group of friends dubbed the Merry Pranksters, in a multicolored school bus outfitted with sound equipment and film cameras. By 1966, the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco had become the center of the counterculture movement. You can find shops selling psychedelic posters, books on metaphysics, funky clothing, drug paraphernalia, and tickets to concerts at Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium.
The Great Society was a legislative program that would end poverty and racial injustices. By the end of Johnson's term, Congress had passed 206 of Johnson's measures. LBJ and Congress changed Social Security by establishing Medicare and Medicaid, along with the Immigration Act of 1965, that opened the door for many non-European immigrants to settle in the U.S. In the end, no president legally in the post-World War II era extended the power and reach of the federal government more than Lyndon Johnson.
Meanwhile, in Vietnam, in response to a Vietnam attack that killed 8 Americans, Johnson unleashed Operation Rolling Thunder the first sustained bombing of North Vietnam.
During the summer of 1967, known as the Summer of Love, over 75,000 young people came to San Francisco, drawn by the spirit, music, and ideals that were transforming the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood into a counterculture mecca. Ushering in the Summer of Love was the country's first major rock festival, organized in a community south of San Francisco. The Monterey Pop Festival featured most of the San Francisco bands, as well as the first U.S. appearance of Jimi Hendrix Experience and British rock band The Who.
Things took a drastic turn on April 4, 1968, when Martin Luther King was shot to death at a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, by James Earl Ray from over 200 feet away. At a nearby motel, Ray struck King in the neck, and Martin Luther King Jr. would die an hour later at St. Joseph's Hospital.
Following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, the Republican nominee, former Vice President Richard Nixon, won the election over the Democratic nominee, Vice President Herbert Humphrey, in a campaign that promised to restore law and order.
In March of 1965, the first American combat troops began arriving in South Vietnam. By June, more than 50,000 U.S. soldiers were fighting in the war. The Vietnam War had officially become Americanized. By the end of the war, 20% of American combat details were representing 10% of the U.S. population. The Defense Department instituted draft lottery system in 1969, which resulted in a low troop morale because of racism. 10,000 women served as military nurses for the Red Cross and United States organization.
Women were slowly becoming very involved in society, but their rights and demands were still not being heard. The second wave feminism, also known as the Women's Liberation Movement, focused on gaining women equal pay, taking control of their own sexuality, breaking out from oppressive gender roles, and gaining greater access to jobs, education, and reproductive health care. In November of 1969, the Congress to Unite Women made a number of demands: nationwide free child care centers, an end to tracking systems in schools that directed women into home economics, and the establishment of women's studies sections in all public libraries and women's programs at colleges.
Finally, on July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 spacecraft, piloted by Michael Collins and module pilot Buzz Aldrin, made its first trip to the moon. It took about 6.5 hours to reach the moon and spent 6 hours in lunar orbit. Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon and continued with his famous saying, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
I'm going to step off the limit. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.